Deadlines as weapons of power are not new, but in the modern geopolitical landscape, they have become more sophisticated, more public, and far more theatrical. When a political leader announces a fixed timeline for military action or a forced agreement, it is designed to create urgency, fear, and psychological pressure not only on the targeted nation, but on the entire international community. This kind of deadline is not merely a diplomatic tactic, it is a form of political theater that reshapes narratives, dominates media cycles, and reframes complex international issues into simple, dramatic choices of submission or confrontation. The announcement of such a deadline immediately triggers reactions across multiple layers of society. Financial markets begin to fluctuate as investors anticipate instability. Energy traders respond to the possibility of disrupted supply chains. Governments of allied nations rush to issue statements trying to balance loyalty with caution. Ordinary citizens watching from their homes feel the tension without having any real influence over the decisions being made. In this way, a single declaration of a deadline becomes a global event, spreading uncertainty far beyond the borders of the countries directly involved. What makes these deadlines especially powerful is their emotional impact. They are framed as decisive moments, as tests of strength and credibility. Political leaders often use strong language to present themselves as firm, unyielding, and in control. This creates a narrative where backing down is portrayed as weakness, even if compromise might be the most rational path forward. The result is a political environment where flexibility is punished and escalation is rewarded, encouraging leaders to double down rather than step back. There is also a strategic dimension that is often hidden from public view. By setting a deadline, powerful states can manipulate the timing of global attention. News cycles become focused on the countdown, reducing space for deeper discussions about the historical context, the root causes of the conflict, and the humanitarian consequences. The complexity of international relations is compressed into a ticking clock, where the urgency of the moment overshadows the long term implications of the choices being made. Deadlines also serve as signals to domestic audiences. They are tools for political branding, allowing leaders to present themselves as tough on foreign adversaries. This can be especially effective during election seasons or periods of declining public support when dramatic foreign policy moves can shift attention away from economic struggles or internal political failures. In this sense, international tension becomes a resource that can be exploited for domestic political gain. At the global level, these deadlines reinforce existing power hierarchies. Nations with military and economic dominance can impose timelines and conditions, while weaker states are forced to react. This imbalance turns diplomacy into a one sided negotiation, where pressure replaces mutual respect and cooperation. Over time, this practice normalizes the idea that power determines legitimacy, weakening international institutions and undermining the principle of equal sovereignty. When deadlines become weapons, they do not just threaten war, they transform the entire landscape of global interaction, replacing dialogue with intimidation, replacing patience with urgency, and replacing shared problem solving with confrontational posturing, shaping a world where fear becomes a central tool of governance and control. Economic consequences of conflict politics are often hidden behind patriotic slogans and security rhetoric, yet they are among the most immediate and lasting impacts of international tension. When military threats rise and diplomatic relations deteriorate, markets react long before any missile is launched. Investors shift their money into so called safe assets, currencies fluctuate, and stock markets become volatile. This instability does not remain confined to trading floors or financial institutions. It quickly spreads into everyday life, affecting the prices people pay for fuel, food, housing, and basic necessities. One of the most visible effects is on energy markets. Any escalation involving major oil producing regions or strategic shipping routes immediately triggers speculation and price surges. Even the possibility of conflict can push oil prices upward, increasing transportation costs and raising the price of goods across entire economies. For families already struggling with inflation, these increases mean tighter household budgets and reduced purchasing power. What is presented as a geopolitical strategy becomes in reality a silent tax on ordinary people who have no control over the decisions being made. At the same time, governments often redirect public spending toward military preparedness and defense contracts. Funds that could have been invested in education, healthcare, public transportation, or social welfare are instead allocated to weapon systems and security infrastructure. This shift deepens social inequality as public services weaken while private defense corporations see their profits grow. The economic structure begins to favor industries that benefit from conflict rather than those that support long term human development. Another critical impact is on global trade. Heightened tensions disrupt supply chains, delay shipments, and increase insurance costs for international transport. Businesses face uncertainty about tariffs, sanctions, and regulatory changes, making it harder to plan and invest. Small and medium sized enterprises, which lack the financial buffers of large corporations, are often hit the hardest. Workers in export dependent industries may face layoffs or reduced hours, while consumers experience shortages and higher prices. Conflict politics also have long term consequences for developing economies. Countries that rely on stable trade relationships and foreign investment become more vulnerable when global uncertainty rises. Capital flows slow down, infrastructure projects are delayed, and economic growth weakens. This can trap entire regions in cycles of debt and dependency, making it harder for them to build resilient economies and reduce poverty. Perhaps the most troubling aspect is how these economic costs are distributed. The burden falls disproportionately on working class communities, low income families, and vulnerable populations. Meanwhile, financial elites and corporations with access to insider information and sophisticated investment strategies often profit from volatility. This creates a system where crisis becomes an opportunity for the few and a hardship for the many. When politics of confrontation dominate global affairs, the economy becomes a battlefield of its own, where inflation, unemployment, and inequality replace tanks and missiles as the tools of damage, reshaping societies in ways that are less visible than war, but equally destructive. The illusion of strength through ultimatums is one of the most persistent myths in modern politics. Leaders often present threats, sanctions, and rigid demands as proof of decisiveness and authority, creating the image of control and dominance. This performance of power is designed to impress domestic audiences and intimidate foreign rivals, but it rarely produces the cooperation it promises. Instead, it transforms diplomacy into a stage where pride and reputation matter more than problem solving and mutual understanding. When an ultimatum is issued, it narrows the space for dialogue. Negotiations thrive on flexibility, compromise, and trust. Yet ultimatums demand immediate compliance. They force the targeted nation into a corner where backing down can be perceived as humiliation or political weakness. In such situations, leaders often choose resistance not because it is the most practical option, but because it is the most politically survivable one. This dynamic hardens positions on both sides and makes de escalation far more difficult. There is also a psychological dimension at work. Ultimatums create an emotional environment of confrontation where fear and anger dominate public discourse. Media narratives amplify this tension, portraying international relations as a contest between winners and losers rather than a shared effort to address complex global challenges. Citizens are encouraged to rally behind their governments in the name of national pride, even when the policies being promoted may lead to economic hardship or long term instability. Sanctions, often used alongside ultimatums, further illustrate this illusion of strength. While they are intended to pressure governments into changing behavior, they frequently end up hurting civilian populations more than political elites. Essential goods become more expensive or scarce, healthcare systems struggle to access critical supplies, and everyday life becomes more difficult for ordinary people. Instead of weakening authoritarian structures, sanctions can sometimes strengthen them by allowing leaders to blame external enemies for internal problems. Another overlooked consequence is the erosion of international norms. When powerful nations rely on threats rather than cooperative frameworks, they signal to the world that rules can be bent or ignored when convenient. This undermines international institutions that were created to manage conflict through dialogue and collective decision making. Over time, the global system becomes more fragmented, with countries prioritizing unilateral action over multilateral cooperation. The illusion of strength also distorts domestic politics. Leaders who rely on confrontational tactics often use foreign threats to distract from internal economic struggles, social inequality, or political scandals. By shifting public attention to external enemies, they avoid accountability at home and reinforce a narrative of constant crisis that justifies extraordinary measures and reduced democratic oversight. What appears on the surface as bold leadership is, in many cases, a fragile performance that depends on escalation to maintain credibility. Each new threat requires a stronger response to sustain the image of toughness, creating a dangerous cycle where retreat becomes impossible and compromise is framed as defeat, pushing nations closer to conflict while claiming to pursue security and stability. Global double standards in foreign policy reveal one of the deepest contradictions in the international system. When powerful nations issue threats, impose sanctions, or intervene militarily, these actions are often described as necessary measures for stability, security, or the defense of global order. Yet, when smaller or less influential countries take steps to protect their own interests or respond to external pressure, they are quickly labeled as aggressive, irresponsible, or destabilizing. This imbalance in how actions are judged is not accidental. It is built into a global structure where power shapes narratives and determines whose voice is considered legitimate. These double standards are visible in the way international law is applied. Rules that are strictly enforced against weaker states are frequently ignored or reinterpreted when they inconvenience powerful ones. Military interventions carried out by major powers are often justified under broad claims of humanitarian concern or national security, while similar actions by less powerful countries are condemned as violations of sovereignty. This selective application of principles weakens the credibility of international institutions and erodes trust among nations. Media coverage also plays a crucial role in reinforcing these unequal standards. Conflicts involving powerful countries are often framed in language that emphasizes strategic necessity and moral justification, while the actions of weaker states are portrayed in more negative or simplistic terms. This shapes public opinion and creates a global narrative that normalizes the behavior of dominant powers while delegitimizing the concerns and perspectives of others. As a result, audiences around the world receive an incomplete and biased understanding of complex geopolitical realities. Economic influence further amplifies this imbalance. Powerful nations and their allies often control key financial institutions, trade networks, and investment flows. This allows them to impose economic pressure on targeted countries through sanctions and restrictions while shielding themselves from similar consequences. Smaller economies, heavily dependent on global trade and foreign investment, are far more vulnerable to these measures. The result is a system where economic tools become extensions of political power, reinforcing existing inequalities. These double standards also affect diplomatic negotiations. When one side enters talks with significantly more leverage, the process becomes less about mutual compromise and more about enforcing predetermined outcomes. Agreements reached under such conditions often lack fairness and sustainability as they fail to address the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. Over time, this breeds resentment and mistrust, making future cooperation even more difficult. At a deeper level, global double standards reflect a broader crisis of legitimacy in the international order. Many people around the world see a system that claims to promote equality and justice while consistently privileging the interests of a few powerful actors. This perception fuels skepticism, resistance, and the rise of alternative alliances that challenge the existing balance of power. When fairness becomes conditional and rules apply differently depending on who holds power, the promise of a truly cooperative global community fades, leaving behind a world where dominance replaces dialogue and influence outweighs principle. The choice between war cycles and cooperative security represents one of the most critical crossroads in modern global politics. For decades, international relations have been shaped by repeated patterns of tension, escalation, retaliation, and temporary ceasefires, only to return again to confrontation. This cycle has created a world that is constantly on edge, where resources are poured into military preparedness while social and economic needs remain underfunded. Choosing cooperation over conflict requires a fundamental shift in priorities from dominance and control toward shared responsibility and collective stability. War cycles thrive on fear and mistrust. When nations operate under the assumption that security can only be achieved through superior force, they invest heavily in weapon systems and strategic alliances designed to counter perceived threats. This approach often leads to arms races, where each side feels compelled to outmatch the other. Instead of producing safety, it creates a fragile balance built on the risk of miscalculation. A single misunderstanding, political misstep, or regional incident can escalate into a larger confrontation, dragging multiple countries into conflict. Cooperative security offers an alternative framework, Rather than relying on threats and military superiority, it emphasizes dialogue, transparency, and mutual assurance. This model recognizes that many modern challenges, such as economic instability, climate change, cyber threats, and public health crises, cannot be solved through force. They require coordination, information sharing, and long term partnerships. By investing in diplomatic institutions and regional cooperation mechanisms, nations can address common problems while reducing the likelihood of violent confrontation. Economic cooperation is a key component of this shift. When countries are economically interdependent in fair and balanced ways, the cost of conflict becomes higher and the incentive for peace grows stronger. Trade agreements, development partnerships, and joint infrastructure projects can create shared interests that discourage aggressive behavior. Instead of competing over resources and markets, nations can collaborate to expand opportunities and improve living standards for their populations. Another important element is the role of public awareness and civic engagement. Citizens around the world increasingly recognize that war and militarization come with enormous human and economic costs. When people demand accountability and transparency from their leaders, it becomes harder to justify aggressive policies driven by political ambition or corporate interests. A more informed and active public can push governments toward policies that prioritize diplomacy and social investment over confrontation. The transition from war cycles to cooperative security also requires reforming global institutions. International organizations must become more representative, more transparent, and more capable of resolving disputes fairly. When smaller and developing nations feel that their voices matter, they are more likely to engage constructively in global decision making. This inclusivity strengthens the legitimacy of international agreements and increases the chances of long term stability. Ultimately, this choice is about redefining what security truly means. It is not just the absence of immediate threats, but the presence of economic opportunity, social justice, political stability, and mutual trust. A world built on cooperation does not eliminate conflict entirely, but it provides tools to manage disagreements without resorting to violence, creating pathways for sustainable peace that benefit not only powerful nations, but humanity as a whole and future generations who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions and the structures of global power that continue to shape international relations and determine whether the next chapter is written in confrontation or collaboration.